From show Lao to retreating now, Marvel Snap players are passionate about a lot of things. But one thing they're even more passionate about than the rest is yelling on the internet. This is Marvel Snap Hot Takes. If a card is not viable for more than a year, then it should be reworked. This is a really interesting case, I think, because I think there's going to be, the biggest issue is that there are a lot of definitions of the word viable. If a card is not viable, where? If a card is not viable in high-level infinite play? If a card is not viable in mediocre rank 70 play? If a card is not viable, by which you mean it doesn't have a positive win rate and a positive cube rate, or not viable, by which you mean it has like a 40% win rate? What are your bars for what viable actually means? That's kind of where this question is the most stringently asked. I mentioned on Twitter that I think there are a couple of business reasons that go beyond the sort of just debatable nature of viability that make this a little bit awkward, because one of the great things about card games is a card doesn't have to be good for you to fall in love with it. I've talked ad nauseum on this channel about my love of the Magic card Krosan Cloudscraper, which is unbelievably terrible. One of the worst cards ever, but I wouldn't be in this position if I didn't fall in love with that card, or Grinning Demon, or any number of like really cool but ultimately kind of terrible cards when I started playing the game. And if someone had taken those cards away from me and said, well, it's because they're not good at the Pro Tour, I would have been mad. I would have been very angry. And I think there are people who like certain cards and definitely don't want them to be reworked, even if the fact is that the shape of those cards makes it difficult for them to ever be good because they are hard candidates to see things like a buff. I think Jean Grey is a really good example. There is a certain type of person that is going to be really into that kind of effect. It is the kind of effect that you probably don't ever see a lot of buffs to, but there are going to be people who are really into it. Green Goblin, Hobgoblin. These are cards that are almost by design, you don't want them to be viable at the top levels of gameplay, which I assume for the sake of argument that this person is talking about. But again, arguing over what the word viable means is the first problem, and I'd like to talk about the second. This is the biggest thing. I don't think you should be taking things away from players unless you have a very good reason. You need an extremely good reason to mess with any game piece. Look at Ghost, for example. I could not name a card I cared about less. I could not name a card I cared about less than Ghost if I had a million years. But there were still people who were upset that the option was taken away from them. Especially a card that in a game where there is so much tension around the ownership of cards, having individual game pieces with unique functions is incredibly valuable just in case it makes you feel good to have those options. I think that kind of thing is just so hard to sell me on. As much as I would like to believe that this is a good idea, I think that largely it would engender way more backlash than would be gained by doing it. I think that the differences between top-level competitive play, or really any spot on the ladder and any other spot on the ladder, would make many of these decisions seem out of touch, in much the same way as Reddit reacted when Move was nerfed. What are they doing? This is ridiculous. Move isn't even good, because it was really only good at the top end of ladder. And I think that kind of stuff is really what you want to avoid. You want to avoid disconnect there, and you want to avoid taking things away from players. So as much as I would like to live in a world where there was a game that did this, I don't think Marvel Snap is well positioned to be that game. Season Pass cards should be both new and established player friendly as a standard part of their design, even if the veterans complain about it, and drop to Series 4 immediately after their season so newer players can scoop them up more easily. There are two things here, and I'm going to start at the back end. I don't think they should drop to Series 4 because I think that is really terrible monetization practice and would probably lose them a bunch of money. Now, I'm not saying that, like, they deserve to make $1 jillion or anything, but I am saying that the Season Pass is already the best deal you can get in the game, in large part because of the card. And if you just said, well, wait a month and you get the card for 3,000 tokens, which is functionally free, I don't think you'd be incentivizing doing much other than not getting the Season Pass. In fact, for a new player, the season pass is often the only thing I would recommend they ever invest in if they're going to spend money on this game. And I wouldn't even be able to do that. So just from a business perspective, I think that idea is kind of a non-starter. Frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if they were upset that season passes were available at all in the shop. I think that they get a lot marketing wise out of that. And I don't think that I'd be able to like straight face tell them that this would be a good idea, because I think it would probably lose them a ton of money. But I do think the other part of this question is pretty interesting, because when you think about a card like Star-Lord or a card like Shou Lao, I think you start to see that there's kind of a debatable amount of what that means, of what it means to be a season pass designed for both new and established players. I think you could argue Star-Lord is a pass that is very designed to be that. He's a high evo card that established players use as a combo card. Very designed to be like that. Shou Lao is designed to work with Merlin, designed to work with skills, designed to work with Kitty Pryde. It's a card that is also quite strong if you get him early, though. You can play him in a Thanos deck, which you get when you end up playing the game for 28 days. I think that there really isn't a distinction in my mind between a card that is good for new players and a card that is good for late game players, beyond how much other synergy does the package take to make work. But I don't really think that's in their control, in the sense of, like, when you look ahead to something like Apocalypse or several of the other cards that seem data mined, like, it makes sense to me that Apocalypse, which is like a pretty easy, straightforward card, is the one on the season pass. And then something like Iska, which probably goes in the Invisible Woman deck and not many other places, is not a season pass card, or is on the season pass plus, or whatever it is, not the base season pass. I think that largely what you're speaking to, though, is broadness of appeal, which is something I think they already do with a season pass. Like, this is one of those cases where I think that the business case for doing what you're suggesting is actually really good. They want to make a card that a bunch of different people in different situations want to buy. The problem is, the easiest way to do that is to make that card really strong. And that runs risks, right? Like, it's hard to make a card that a lot of different people want to buy that isn't super busted. And I think riding that fence is sort of the art of what design is. Snap moving from a game where the difference in winning and losing is 25 power beats 24 power to a game where the difference is 50 power beats 40 makes me want to play so much less. I recognize that's subjective, but it feels more like a game where deck choice is more important than in-game choice. Yeah, this was always the risk of the tech apocalypse, right? What tech does when it's really powerful is keep the point totals in a game lower artificially. And when the game's point totals are lower artificially and you're able to color within the lines of what the tech is dictating to you, a lot more decks are viable because a lot more decks can hit that lower point threshold. Compared to right now, when if you can't beat things like Manspider or Finfang Fooms and Hulks and things of that nature, you're kind of just getting outpointed. There are going to be fewer viable decks in that sense, and games are going to feel more on rails and more predictable. This was always the risk of the tech apocalypse, and I think they successfully avoided it for a while, but I think cards like Shou Lao and Star-Lord have pushed us further and further that direction, and I think that that is the kind of thing that maybe you can do the tech apocalypse, but then also leaning into it with Shou Lao and Star-Lord and Manspider and all of these things that encourage these combo decks. Maybe that's what made it the bridge too far. Either way, I do think we've probably slid a little bit far. And this is, like, you're marking it as subjective, but you're hitting on something real here. When the game is 24 versus 25, your individual decisions on placement of power matter way more. And that is what tech brought us. Like, this is why I was always such a big defender of it, to the point of thinking it was a bad idea as they did it and only realizing that it was totally fine after we had a couple of months of it being totally fine. And now I think we are at a point where it's no longer totally fine. But the base premise of objection to the tech apocalypse was always that tech artificially constrains a metagame. It makes things smaller. And when things are smaller, individual decisions matter more, there's more skill expression, and matchups are closer. And I think those things are good for the game. And I'm interested to see what they think about this. Because I remember when the Cosmic Ghost Rider nerf happened, I was like, oh God, maybe they've gone too far with this. And again, like, it wasn't necessarily true. I think a deck that I really like being viable is Ramp. I think Ramp is a good example of a deck where it's like, if I can play that, I think the metagame's probably okay. I don't know that I can play that right now. And I think that that's kind of notable. Like up until January, this was kind of copacetic for me. I was okay with this. I was like, all right, it's okay. The Techpocalypse, we're good. We're still playing some disruptive mid-range decks. Even until through Sholau, we're playing disruptive mid-range. But I do wonder if we are hitting a point. And I don't think this is an inappropriate take to have. I just think that it's also important to understand why you feel that way. And why you feel that way is because, well, it's the other side of the coin from tech cards controlling everything, is that when you are controlled, if you play within those lines, there's a ton of skill expression. And you get into the core gameplay of Marvel Snap, which has always been the game's strength, and point allocation has always been the coolest part of skill expression. When point allocation matters, I think the game's in a really good spot. And it has mattered a lot less recently. And I think that that is what you're speaking to here. Community opinions should be the least factor affecting changes. I think this is mostly true. I am of the opinion that community sentiment matters, but you can't over-index for, like, people being online. You know what I mean? When I would think that community sentiment matters is when you can see on the back end with second dinner data, player drop-off and trace it back to an action, right? That's when community sentiment matters. When community sentiment doesn't matter is people yelling on the internet. The only place that matters is in videos like this. This is the only time that I think they should ever be thinking about that kind of stuff. I think that community sentiment is important, but it is important as a gauge of community health. And I think people mistake community sentiment for posts on Reddit and Discord and Twitter way too much. I don't think that they are representative of anything by nature. They could be. They're a signal, but they're also noise, right? When Interrobang is complaining about something, it's a day that ends in Y. That's normal, right? And I love the guy, but that's true. When I'm talking about stuff like this, it's a day that ends in Y. I like myself a pretty good deal too, but I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I'm representative. When I do videos about the Marvel Snap economy, I do my best to step into other people's shoes because my shoes are so incredibly non-representative. And I think that this kind of stuff is important to talk about, but I don't think you should give too much credit to the people that are yelling on the internet. Like, here's an example. Sometimes I look at Second Dinner's comments when they post stuff on Twitter. I realize that's my mistake, right? But I went to Second Dinner's comments when they announced the streamer thing that they were doing. And the comments on Twitter were like, it's pretty good stuff. And then at the bottom it was like, you guys should give away season passes, you goddamn idiots. And it's like, okay, well, they actually do. Everyone who's going to be streaming is going to be giving away season passes that they got from Second Dinner. They actually are doing that. And this person is still mad at them. And it's like, I think that if you over-index for people that are angry on the internet, you're not going to end up helping the people who actually play and enjoy your game. And I think that that's a real risk when you spend time in online spaces where hyperbolic stuff is rewarded, right? This online spaces reward loudness. They don't reward nuance. They reward quick, pithy, jokey type, implication-y, clickbaity. This deck is busted. Oh my God, it's the craziest thing ever. Oh my God, Second Dinner is evil. They don't reward talking about things in the world that actually exists. They reward creating a caricature. And I think that if you engage with that too heavily, you are the people inside of Plato's cave. You are not engaging with reality. You are engaging with a shadow play that sometimes resembles it. And I think that that's probably bad. Not that everyone who's mad is wrong. Just that I see a lot more people who are mad about this game than are happy about this game. And I don't think that makes sense, because if that was true, I don't think the game would exist. I think largely most people that play a game tend to like the game. And it frustrates them, I'm a big fan of Mountain Blade Bannerlord. I can't tell you that I haven't been mad as hell at that game, but I like the game. And I think that over-indexing for the moments of frustration that grab traction on the internet is probably a bad idea. Cards shouldn't be deleted because they have a high play rate or are problematic. Loki, Mr. Fantastic First Steps, Prof X, resources are investments, and it's SD's job to make things at least remotely viable, especially when it costs time and money from the players. Health of the game versus trust is a real issue. Yeah, I mean, I think the bottom part is the truest part of this. Health of the game versus trust is extremely a real issue. That's a really important thing for them to try to manage. I think they made a mistake on Mr. Fantastic First Steps. I think they were exactly right about what they did to Professor X, though. Like, that's sort of the thing, is like, there's not just like a one-size-fits-all solution for this. You can't just be like, never kill a card and then point to Professor X, a card who, let's be honest here, is not dead. He's just not amazing. Like, when you talk about stuff like this, you want a card to not, like, people look at not being incredibly good as a, like, betrayal, right? With Mr. Fantastic First Steps, I think there's an argument for it in large part because of his versatility becoming part of his card identity. With Professor X, I don't think there's an argument for that. I think saying that you think Professor X should be good is actually insane to me. Like, it is crazy to think that. That is one of the least interactive cards in the entirety of the game. It gets rid of one of the most interesting things about Marvel Snap, which is the way in which power distribution matters, and turns the game into a one-lane win this factory. When it worked with Cannonball, that was extremely stupid. It was not a mistake to get rid of that. It was the correct decision, and casting it as a mistake because of some imagined trust factor is ridiculous. I would trust them less if they decided that they needed to keep a card strong so that people wouldn't yell at them for nerfing it. That would be worse, because you'd be effectively saying that the whales get to do this, and then they get to do this forever, and then you have to build something that is better than that if you ever want to sell them anything ever again. It is a very bad idea. I do not think that that is the right way to balance. Was Mr. Fantastic First Steps a mistake? Yes. Was Loki a mistake? Honestly, I kind of think they could go back to the old Loki at 4-5. I'd kind of be interested to see what happens, but I wouldn't really push it, you know? Like, I think that basically some of these things can be undone, but the mistake with Loki was letting him live too long, not getting rid of him. Like, that guy was problematic. You had to do something about it. And I would feel a lot worse if they just sort of stretched that out over periods of time when everyone can kind of see that the card is a problem. Imagine if they didn't nerf Show Lao, you know? Imagine how we'd be acting right now. Oh, they didn't nerf Show Lao. God, I can't believe that these, you know, the filthy whale baiters, you know? Imagine, but like, they did. They took a small whack at him, and it seems to have been a fairly substantial change. It seems like it got him in the exact right spot. Currently, we'll see. Metagame's weird right now. But I just don't really buy the idea that they're never supposed to nerf a card like that. I think the alternative is way worse. Now is a better time than the future for memes and for the Galactus fans to make him a 6-7. Yep. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one. Have a wonderful evening.